Welcome to this week's study of the book of Hebrews. We continue to explore, extract, and experience the love of God through the study of the book. This week we're looking at Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, Jesus, the giver of rest. Now in these two chapters, the key words are faith, today, and rest. We'll see how these words build up in our lesson and how Paul uses these words to communicate a message to the Hebrews. A recap of the previous lesson. Remember, in chapter 1, we dealt with the divinity of Christ. In chapter 2, we dealt with the humanity of Christ. But today, we want to look at Jesus as the giver of rest. Now, interestingly, chapter 3 starts with the encouragement to keep our eyes on Jesus Christ, i.e., the high priest. And it ends in chapter 4 with a call to come boldly to the throne of grace. Now, in between, Paul starts by introducing Moses, a man well revered by the Jewish Christians. He describes how Moses was faithful in his role of leading the Israelites from Egypt to Canaan. His role was to redeem them from Egypt through faith, walk with them through the desert through faith, and to give them rest in Canaan through faith. Now in Egypt, the Israelites couldn't worship freely, couldn't nurture a relationship with God freely, and couldn't be a full, complete, true witness of God because they were slaves. Now, God redeemed them, saved them, before they could worship Him, before they could witness about Him, and even before they knew or obeyed His instructions. Now, God saves us today before we can worship Him, before we can witness, before we can obey Him. Now, redemption and salvation comes first. Paul goes further and describes how the Israelites failed to enter the earthly Canaan because of lack of faith. Moses was faithful, but the Israelites lacked faith. Now, all those who lacked faith perished in the desert. They failed to enter God's rest. Now, they left Egypt, but never arrived. To start is good, but to finish is the goal. Many start well, but along the way, people drift, people get discouraged, people get distracted, people get disturbed, even depressed, sometimes, unfortunately, delusional. Now, we ought to make a point to finish what we start. To start is good, but to finish is the goal. Now, by the borders of the promised land, they had a discussion with the spies who had just returned from spying in Canaan. One thing of interest is that regarding the facts on the ground, the spies were in agreement. Were they giants? They agreed. Was it indeed the land of milk and honey? Yes, they agreed. Was the city fortified? Yes, they agreed. Regarding facts, they agreed. Where they differed was on faith. Faith became the game changer. Lack of faith meant life in Canaan or death in the desert. Now we can only enter God's rest through faith, not facts. Facts have a place that they play, but after facts are put on the table, your faith needs to kick in. Your faith needs to kick in. One songwriter says, "Oh brother, be faithful, soon Jesus will come." Now Paul adds a message and says in Hebrews chapter 4 verse 2, now the message that the Israelites had no value to them because they did not share the faith of those who obeyed. Now, when we have our facts, we need to add faith to them. Facts alone will not save us. We need to add faith to the facts. After Paul gives a brief history of the Israelite journey, he brings the message home. He says, if you hear his voice today, don't harden your hearts as they did in the wilderness. The context has completely changed. Paul is no longer talking about the earthly Canaan. He's now talking about God's rest. Now, Paul plays around with two different words, like a pianist who uses different keys on a keyboard to create a song or a melody. Paul uses the word rest in its different forms in Greek to send a multitude of lessons, which is impossible to exhaust in this lesson. Now, the two words that Paul refers to are kataposis and sabbatismos. Now, kataposis refers to cessation, finding a habitation after traveling, or a dwelling place, like what happened with Noah's Ark when it found a place to kataposis, to rest on Mount Ararat, or calming of the winds. Now, sabbatismos means the same thing with kataposis, but only with the added aspect of marking time, which is seventh day or seventh year or weekly Sabbath rest, which also then includes worship. So Paul uses these two words of rest to talk about ceasing and also to bring in a spiritual aspect in it. Paul says that even if Joshua, who took over Moses, eventually took you to the promised land, you might have had physical rest, kataposis, but not spiritual rest, sabbatismos. Hence, Paul says God's promise of rest still remains. The Jewish Christians understood both as they worshipped on a Sabbath. The message that Paul wants to bring out is that the rest you experience after working, after traveling, and the rest that you experience when you worship on a Sabbath, if you combine that rest, Paul is saying that God can give us that rest continually through Jesus Christ. And not only that, he says that it is like a foretaste of heaven when Jesus comes for the second time. That rest that we experience when we cease work is the same rest that we'll experience when we are saved. Now, this rest will have a lot of other meanings. It also means that, we cease trying to earn our salvation through our works. Paul is saying, rest from that. It also means that Paul is trying to say that you also find benefit in worshiping God. So find rest in that. Now, we all know the verse that says, "Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." When we enter rest, into God's rest, we looking at the book of Hebrews, it would be like if you fix your eyes on Jesus, you're entering God's rest. If you listen to his voice, if you have faith in him, if you draw near to the throne of grace, Paul is saying through these things, we will enter God's rest. And that rest is only found in Jesus Christ. In conclusion, Paul then introduces the word today. 5 times today is mentioned in chapter 3 and chapter 4. Now, today is the day of opportunity. Paul is saying today is the day that one has to make a decision promptly. It's like a word that is encouraging someone to not procrastinate a decision. It's like, it's an urgent matter. Paul is saying you cannot keep pushing this. It reminds me of the story of Felix that's found in Acts chapter 24, verse 25. After Paul had preached about righteousness, self-control, and judgment, Felix was afraid and said, "That's enough for now. You may leave. When I find it convenient, I'll send for you." But guess what? It never happened. It never happened. Felix never got the opportunity to hear Paul preach to him again. Now, brethren, today, let us rest in the faith of Jesus Christ. May the Lord add a blessing to the reading of his word. Amen.